autobiography is non-fiction, but it isn't really quite that. We each have an image of ourselves, of who we are, and an autobiography is a fictionalized description of ourselves because we pick and choose what we say and how we see ourselves. And the vision of an autobiography is just a series of facts, a series of occurrences, and a description of one thing happening after the other. That's really not the way I see that. I was intent on showing the ups and downs. I saw no value in just describing my life. And although, yes, that was the framework and the backbone of what I wrote, I tried very hard, and you can tell me better than I can to what extent I succeeded. I tried to show a reflection of life as it would apply during that time in a broader sense.
Right. There's a lot of history there. Yeah.
Well, I
World
happened
history.
to live through the history of the emigration, and that emigration certainly marked the rest of my life. And it did make me more open to the difficulties that people go through. And I have always, as I say in my choice of jobs, looked for more interaction with people than with machinery. I was a physical scientist, but the picture of my sitting in a laboratory room and not talking to people is not one that is accurate. I tried very hard to have human contact, and that was why I chose the particular job that I had, even though that was a little more difficult to get than the straight research jobs in government or private laboratories.
So, pre-World War II, the 1920s, and a Europe that's gone, World War II, a refugee, America in the 1950s and 60s, education as it's evolved in this country. You've been through a lot of it. You've lived a long life, and you've been very involved in this world. So, and I got a lot of history from the book.
Well, that's why I tried to write some of these things down. Not as, well, let's say partly as a progression of what life was like, certainly about the time in Vienna, which seemed so secure and then blew up in our faces, but also in the life of looking for a job in the educational systems, which largely failed me. I have these excellent memories of what I learned in high school in Vancouver, but the universities were not a good match. Not any of, not, I went to several, and the educational system there was so flawed and so fragmented. I felt I really listened and profited as I could, but had to put that education together in my own way. My father was a rather passive figure. The dominant person in the family was my mother. Whatever happened was what she planned and decided and made to work. My father would not have left Vienna. And there are as many examples as you can think of men who felt that way and often caused the family to stay and eventually to perish. He said, I'm not leaving. This isn't going to last, and the Nazi invasion has to be something that we live through. My mother, from the beginning of that time, said, I've got to get that kid out.
She was a pragmatist. She saw. She just didn't hide behind what was happening. You think?
She didn't anticipate it. There are people who anticipated it and knew enough about what was going in the world. That's not what happened to her. But as soon as she saw the Nazi flags in the street, the people parading, shouting, slogans, she said, we've got to get out of here. And she totally devoted herself to getting me out. And when the time came, she left with me. My father didn't come. And as a result, he was picked up by the police a short time later, sent to a concentration camp. And there are 500,000 people who died in that concentration camp. And the fact that he survived even there is also partly my mother's doing, because she found somebody who paid for a ticket away to the one place that we knew of where you didn't have to have a visa, and that was Shanghai. And there's a community of refugees that did that and stayed in Shanghai,
Right.
sometimes for long times.
Yeah.
My father had a ticket. He made his way to England. He never went and never used the ticket, but it made it possible for him to get out. And eventually, I remember the time when he arrived in Vancouver, when I was there by myself, and I went to the ship to pick him up. And again, the question has been by some people, was that an emotional time? It was 3 years after we had seen each other last. I think not. He was a somewhat emotional person, and he broke down and cried easily, but that wasn't me. In fact, when he came, I was alone, and I felt that I had to take care of him. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know much English, and I had been there by that time. I had been to school. I had been to high school. I had just graduated from high school, and I was ready to take on that responsibility, and that worked fairly well. That's the time when a refugee committee paid for a room where we stayed, and they paid the rent, but I paid for everything else out of earnings during that year when I had several jobs. Again, just a couple of years after I'd ever heard my first word of English. But that worked pretty well. You talk about how passive he was. We were together and we talked, all the time. But I didn't really learn much about him.
Yeah, I interrupt. It sounds like he was like an uncle or a cousin. That's the feeling I got from the book, not a father.
Uh-huh. I think that's a correct observation. We lived side by side, but he never opened up about his experiences.
The internment camps, everything. Right?
In the camps, as soon as he arrived in England, he was interned as an enemy alien. And he also didn't talk about his early life. He was born in Hungary, not very far from Vienna. This was all a part of Middle Europe that was where countries were very close to each other. But I never learned anything about his family. I knew his mother slightly, but all the time I knew her, she was in bed. And I knew one of his sisters, he was one of 5. But I never really learned about them or his life with them or even what happened to them later. There was a group that thought of themselves as sort of an elite. They were the future, and they looked down on the few Jews that were in the class, and it was obvious that they regarded us as really half existence, only half in existence. And when the Anschluss, the taking over by Germany, occurred, the only difference is really that when they met each other in the morning, instead of just clicking heels and shaking hands as they had done before, they raised their hands in the Hitler salute. And it was clear that they had been a hidden group.
All along.
With
Scary.
that in mind all along, yes. But, that had not been apparent before. The Nazi Party had been illegal, but on that day, in 1938, they came out, and it's clear that that was how they felt. But they saw themselves not as people who harassed the Jews, but as people who were innately superior. The way I got into physics is, of course, through engineering, and I chose engineering because that seemed like a sure way to get a job. And that was really important. I couldn't have imagined studying history or English or any of the humanities because that would have seemed such a luxury. What do you do with that? I couldn't imagine any job with that. And you have to remember that no role model in any of those fields, including physics or engineering. I didn't know anybody who had done anything like what seemed possible for me. So in that sense, I felt alone, and that was a disadvantage because I got into things that I really didn't understand. I didn't know what I was going to get into. But physics was very concrete.
It's close to nature, you said?
And I thought of it as getting to know and using nature, yes. And first with the engineering and then with the physics. And that seemed like something on which our lives are based. When I understood something, I could explain it. It took me a while, you know, I don't know whether I would say I was a fast learner, but once I understood something, I found that I could explain it to others. And that became a main part of my work and my interests. I think I was accepted as a graduate student at Columbia with a teaching assistantship, and the teaching was easy for me. I had done that even before I came to Columbia. But the fact that I had no mentor and nobody to guide me through the maze of courses and requirements,
The politics, the process, the
any of that,
right.
I had no help with that, and nobody who could point out, for example, that I was trying to jump ahead without having a firm basis, and nobody who helped me when I got, which I did, into trouble, and so that my first semester there was something of a disaster. I didn't know that at the time. For example, I was in a class with the most famous of all the people at that time, who was also head of the department, that was I.I. Ravi. But he left halfway through the semester because he was also a major statesman, older statesman by that time, and went to Washington to advise the government or whatever he did. And some other guy came on who taught a totally different kind of course, and I didn't make that transition.
Did you ever think about quitting, or that wasn't in your makeup?
I did not think about quitting.
Not for one
I
second.
thought about the fact that I might not make it,
Oh.
and I had no plan B.
That's
I was just going to go ahead.
Right.
And that's also what happened at other times, but when I was in real difficulty. I just pulled through, and somehow or other that worked in the end. I could easily have fallen by the wayside, and I was pretty close to that sometimes.
Wow.
That elementary physics was taught in a class by itself. It wasn't what I thought was real physics.
Fragmented. It was fragmented, you said.
It was fragmented. It was a jumble of different subjects. There were certain set problems which were well known to the teachers but unknown to the students, and you had to sort of plow through those in an atmosphere where people said, "Well, I had to go through this, so you do too," without really any, to me, logical sequence. And I fought against that while I was a student. And in the end, I wrote a textbook that was an attempt to meet these problems. And I think that was something that worked for me, both in the textbook and in my classes. I like the large classes, sometimes 300 students, the kind of thing that proverbially are thought of as being really terrible, both for the student and for the teacher. But I thought I could make that work, and I think in most cases I did.
Is that correct?
Rutgers, as a university, throughout its history, has gone from being the small colonial college, started in 1766, to the major state university, which is today, and that clash between people who tried to keep it as a colonial college, or at least as a small college, to a large university. That tension between the two directions seems to have been there throughout its history. Livingston College, to which you went after all, was started as a terrific experiment to have a small college within a large university. And I thought that was an incredible new idea
But
that
honestly,
really has not been made to work anywhere. And I admired that enormously, and that was part of that to some extent on the periphery, was not really in the middle of it, partly because the physics department was so against the idea that they did not participate. The members of the physics department decided not to have anything to do with the new college, and that was one of the things, as with math and chemistry, that made it extremely difficult to have a new college. You can't really have a college without these fundamental subjects.
right. What were they so against? What was so unique about the preamble that what Livingston College was supposed to be about?
When the college was founded, the first advertisements for staff members, for faculty members, had in it that they should have a special interest in teaching. And
That was radical? That was radical?
that was not only radical, it was considered by a number of people, particularly in those hard science departments, as a sure way to get a poor faculty. Turned out they were wrong. Some of the most lasting contributing faculty members of the university throughout the ups and downs of the new college came because they saw a new atmosphere with ferment and room for experimentation. But that's not what was seen by, certainly not by the math and hard science departments, and that continues today. There was the first faculty meeting where students essentially sat there passively, not knowing exactly what was going on. But the idea was, and it was an incredibly creative idea, but a dangerous one as it turned out, that faculty and students would sit together in a deliberative body and decide the way the college was going to work. And at that first meeting, nothing much happened. There were committee reports and some sort of rigmarole, which most of the students were unfamiliar with. So that by the second time, a couple of weeks later, they weren't ready to just take that. And there was this famous time when a big black student got up and said, "What is all this bullshit?" And everybody joined in on that. And all of a sudden, the whole meeting was about to collapse. And people said, "We're not going to participate in stuff that doesn't mean anything." And they didn't really understand that they had, at that moment, the possibility and the power to change what was going on. They weren't used to that. They didn't understand the process. And there was a long discussion in which I participated, and many other people did. I tried to tell them that as dean, Ernie Linton had produced a system which was more open and more attuned to what students might want to say and give them a chance to participate than had ever been seen before. And I cautioned them not to throw that away. But that's what happened. The meeting broke up. They decided on 3 days of deliberations, just talking to see what would happen. And at the end of those 3 days, everything continued, but the students and the faculty were no longer in the same meeting. They no longer tried to develop things together, and maybe that was an impossible concept. But it continued so that the students got together and formed what was called a student assembly or something like that, and there was a faculty one separately, and as had been done in every other college, they were separate and talked separately, and that great concept of their working together disappeared.
Wow.
And I was sorry about that because it had been such a creative and wonderful concept, but it was not prepared. Neither the students nor the faculty were really ready to face the fact that this was a totally novel environment that had the possibility of doing things in different ways.
So you think if the groundwork had been laid better, there was possibly a chance it could have worked, this synergy between faculty and students?
Well, I was very enthusiastic about it, but I also saw the complications, and I saw that there had been no work done to prepare either the faculty or the students for what the old system was and for what might be possible under a new system. So it just didn't have a chance.
Can you describe Ernest Litton, the visionary, and someone we both knew? What were his positives and what were his flaws that you think kind of led to not realizing fully the potential of Livingston College?
He had the vision of a college that would be very student-oriented, would also be open and welcoming to minority students in the way that no white institution had ever been. And there were several problems with that. It was all new, so there were bound to be problems. So there was marginal support from the administration. There was little understanding from the prospective students, and in many cases, students applied who could not get or did not get into Rutgers College. So that the idea that we had in the planning committee, of which I was a part, of students who were committed to a new interest in society, were committed to participating in innovation. It didn't really have a chance with students who had never even had contact with the most common kind of education. And that was really a main part of why it didn't work. We had an idea of having a college for students like we would have liked to have been. Well, by this time we were professors and getting on to greater age and experience. We didn't talk about what kind of audience we would have. We didn't talk about the students that would come in, and more importantly, what we would have had to do to prepare them. And I didn't have an outline, I just wrote what came to my mind. And I knew some people would be interested in the early part in Vienna and about the time when the Nazis took over and we had to leave and what came after that. And once I got going, I just kept writing with whatever came next. And it was possible to put in not just stuff about myself and what happened to me, but some reflections on the time and on the places that I lived through.
Was it difficult? I mean, did any time during this did you start crying or laughter or any type of extreme emotion?
No, that's not me. There are some emotional parts, principally about the fact that I learned eventually, not while it happened, but a little later, about my two cousins who were the closest I had to siblings, and they both died in different ways during the war, and so did my grandmother. But I'm not a really emotional person, and I'm not sentimental, and I don't look back to any of what I lived through as really making life very difficult for me. In fact, I had so much support, not only from my mother primarily, and later both parents, but from so many other people, that I have retained a lot of positive memories, and I try to stick to those.
I'm a capitalist. You've written this book. You put your heart and soul in it. The book is called Fragments of Time, on and on. And it's on Amazon. Then I ask you how many people have bought it on Amazon. Because to me, and I'm being long-winded here, if someone actually imparts their own money to listen to your words, I'd be so proud. But you don't seem to care, am I right?
Well, of course I care. I'm interested not in the money. The money, even if I sell 1,000 books, the amount of money I get is not going to change my lifestyle. It's not going to do anything for me. I put much more into the book. I paid for Gail, who acted as an editor over much of it, and not that she changed anything, but she made comments that made me look more careful at what I wrote. So the money is really of no importance to me, and no matter what happens, I will have put more into it that I get out. But I am interested in getting the ideas out. I am interested in seeing it out there and seeing something of what I wanted to say, something of the stories that I wanted to tell, something about the time that I lived in, because I was privileged to do that over all these years that you counted or mentioned. And that is the legacy that I'm interested in. I do want people to listen to what that was like, and the fact that it was not only very varied, but had some wonderful times, both in my work and in my relationships in the family and to other people, as well as times which were just extraordinarily difficult and sometimes unhappy. And that combination together makes for a full life. And I'm just extraordinarily fortunate that I am still leading a full life.
And you seem to be, you live in the moment. You're living today. You're not looking in the past. You're not worrying about tomorrow. You're just doing your thing. Well, Peter Lindenfeld, thank you very much. And also, how many people have bought your book?
I don't know.
See, you're proving my point. You're not a true capitalist. Thanks a lot.